From the 7th of September 1940 to the 16th of May 1941, Britain endured an intensive bombing campaign carried out by the German Luftwaffe. The Blitz claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Londoners, and identifying their bodies was a laborious process. The emergency services were stretched to the limit as fire brigades worked to fight enormous blazes as the bombs continued to fall. By July 1942, thousands of properties had been destroyed, and the bodies of Blitz victims were still being found amongst the ruins. So when on Friday, the 17th of July, demolition workers discovered another body under the floor of a cellar in a burnt-out church, it didn't at first appear that unusual.
The demolition workers took a fairly nonchalant view of this particular body. Although the brunt of the Blitz was over, they were still finding bodies, of course, and the view of the chap who turned up this particular paving slab was just another Blitz victim. In fact, he went to the pub, and only later in the day did he report it to his foreman, who told the police.
The victim had suffered a particularly gruesome death. Parts of the arms and legs were missing, and as the workers carefully lifted the body from the hole, the skull stayed on the ground. The remains were wrapped in brown paper and taken to Southwark mortuary. It was here that forensic pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson and his secretary, Miss Molly Lefebvre, first encountered the body.
Keith Simpson was 34 when I first met him, and he was at the start of what was already promising to be a brilliant career. The mortuary keeper phoned us and said, "We've got some old bones here, sir." And he said, "All right, I'll take a look at them while I'm in the mortuary." And there were these bones, these dusty old bits and pieces. And Dr. Simpson said, well, I won't worry about that now. I'll take it round to Guy's and look at it at my leisure. So we took it up and put it in the lab, and then we started working on it, just looking at it. When I went home about 6 in the evening, he said, "Now you just leave me here and I'm going to enjoy myself with these bones." And I left him cleaning up the bones. He was like a child with a new jigsaw puzzle. It was wonderful. I've never forgotten that.
There were a number of things that Simpson noted at the time of this first examination were going to be crucial. The first, and perhaps most obvious, that was some of the bones had been charred. This body had clearly been burnt. There was a fibroid tumour of the uterus, which showed clearly that the body was female. And covering the body were a yellow, powdery material that he didn't know the origin of.
Dr. Simpson straight away thought that there may be more to this than met the eye. The body had been laid in such a way as to suggest it had been laid deliberately rather than having been deposited there as a result of a bomb blast. Furthermore, there was no bomb crater, so this suggested to him that this was no victim of the Blitz, but possibly the victim of foul play.
When I got there next morning to start the day's work, he greeted me with the words, "It's a murder job, I think, Miss L."
The general condition of the body left Dr. Simpson in no doubt. This was no casualty of war.
When someone's had their head removed and their arms, their feet and hands chopped off and their scalp removed and a blow on the back of the head and all that, it all mounts up and points to murder, doesn't it?
But Dr. Simpson's first priority was to verify when death had taken place.
The police thought that this body had been recovered from an old cemetery and was 50 or 100 years old, or possibly even more. Simpson, with his experience of examining many bodies, knew that that wasn't correct, and his estimate was that the body was between 12 and 18 months old.
This particular site had been blitzed fully 2 years before the discovery of the body. So how could the victim have been the victim of the bombing raid?
And Dr. Simpson had come across many bodies that had suffered the effects of a bomb blast. He knew what to expect. This body, however, was something quite different.
She hadn't been shattered. She hadn't been blasted. She was obviously a person who had died other than in the Blitz.
He noticed the head had actually been severed from the body. The body had been partially burnt. The lower limbs had been partially removed from the body also. And the lower jaw was absent.
Dr. Simpson spent the next 2 afternoons with the police at the site where the skeleton was found in an attempt to recover the missing body parts.
There were 3 tons of earth piled up thanks to the demolition men, and Dr. Simpson literally shifted for himself, got his jacket off, and together with the 2 detectives sieved these 3 tons of earth in search of missing clues.
After hours of searching, nothing. But then Dr. Simpson's eagle eye spotted something else.
What he did find was a curious yellow powder deposited on the earth, powder which analysis revealed was slaked lime.
The use of lime in destroying bodies is quite well known, but it's not slaked lime. Slaked lime is not caustic. What you're looking for is the more ordinary lime.
Slaked lime has the property of preserving tissue rather than destroying it.
The murderer had used the wrong type of lime. He'd wanted to destroy the body, but instead had unintentionally preserved the single grain of evidence that would conclusively prove that this woman had, without doubt, been murdered. This proof came to light when Dr. Simpson made a discovery late one night at his lab.
Simpson dissected many areas of this body, but his attention was particularly drawn to the voice box, the Adam's apple.
Dr. Simpson subjected this to some scrutiny, in particular the thyroid, and he found that there was heavy bruising, under the bruising a fracture.
And that fracture is a sure indication that this is a case of manual strangulation. The injury can't be caused any other way.
So confident was Dr. Simpson of his findings that he was more than willing to testify in a court of law. But what hope was there of convicting a murderer when the question of the woman's identity remained shrouded in mystery?
He then began most systematically to look for evidence about the woman, to identify her and to find out who she was and how she had been killed. So first of all we had to establish sex. Well, that was easy because of the uterus. Then we looked at the palate, the roof of her mouth, and the bones of that suturized much later in life. And we could tell then that she was about 45 years of age.
The second feature that Simpson determined was her height, and he did this by measuring the length of the long bone in her upper arm, the humerus, and by applying that length to some standard tables developed by a man called Pearson, he was able to determine her height, which he gave as 5 feet 1.5 inches.
Whoever had dismembered the victim had gone to great lengths to try and conceal her identity. The face had been removed together with the scalp. But once again, the murderer had unwittingly left yet another clue.
They'd left nothing of her scalp, a tiny little tag of flesh that had some dark brown hair going grey adhering to it. So that gave us quite a good idea that she had dark brown hair going grey. A really good job had been done on her. None of it was accidental. Someone had really set to remove all identification.
The dried uterus found in the woman's pelvis was also noted by Dr. Simpson to be enlarged. On further examination, the swelling proved to be a fibroid tumour 3 to 4 inches in diameter.
The detectives were able to go around all the hospitals in the area and find out if a woman answering that description of height, age, etc., had been a patient at the hospital for a fibroid of the womb.
Dr. Simpson was closing in on the murderer, but perhaps of most value in clinching identification were the victim's teeth.
Everybody's teeth are different, like fingerprints, and certainly her lower jaw was missing and we never found it. But the condition of her upper jaw, which fillings she had, how many teeth she had, was very, very informative.
Dr. Simpson must have been pretty excited about having found all this dental information and might well be the absolute key to identifying who this person was. On reflection, he probably began to kind of come down from that high and say to himself, but are we ever going to find a dentist? How are we going to do that? We've got to have something to compare it with. And I suspect at that stage, he sort of went home and thought, you know, are we ever going to get that far?
Dr. Keith Simpson had exhausted his examinations of the body. He knew that the victim was female and between 40 and 50 years of age. Her hair was dark brown but going grey, and in life she probably attended hospital for a complaint of the uterus. The only thing that was now missing was the woman's name. It was at this time that Divisional Detective Inspector Frederick Hatton, who was on the case, happened to stumble upon a lucky coincidence. The year is 1941, and at 5 o'clock on the afternoon of the 12th of April, a Miss Polly Dubinsky reported her sister, Mrs. Rachel Dobkin, missing. Miss Dubinsky was much distressed by her sister's disappearance and was aware that Rachel had been due to meet up with her estranged husband, Harry Dobkin, the previous day.
Miss Dubinsky detested Harry Dobkin, and she firmly suggested that her sister had come to harm at his hands.
Harry Dobkin was a great snorting bull of a man. He was a Russian Jew. He was born in Russia, but came to this country as a very small baby. He made a living selling bits of tailoring to East End market traders. In 1920, he married a woman called Rachel Dubinsky, who he met through an old-fashioned Jewish marriage broker. The marriage was a complete and utter disaster and lasted just 3 days. Rachel had managed to get pregnant, and as a consequence, she had chased Harry Dobkin for maintenance for the boy that was born as a result. It was £1 a week. Dobkin defaulted on this arrangement for more or less 20 years. In fact, 3 times he'd been to prison for non-payment. And the last time they were seen together was in a cafe in Dalston.
She was still very furious about him threatening not to pay the money, and they had tea together, and she was, causing a bit of a hoo-ha about it all, and he was becoming increasingly fed up.
And after that fateful liaison, Rachel Dobkin was never seen again. The following day, Mrs. Dobkin's handbag was found in a Guildford post office.
It had her ration book in it and her identity card, so obviously she wouldn't have wanted to be parted from that, especially not in wartime, because you couldn't get any food without your ration card, you see, and yet she never tried to get it back, which was rather ominous.
Police at the time were under enormous pressure due to wartime work, and it wasn't uncommon for people to go missing. But Miss Polly Dubinsky was insistent that Harry Dobkin was responsible for her sister's disappearance, so an investigation was opened.
They searched, but they couldn't find any sign of her, and I think they interviewed him, and nothing came of it all.
There was no real hard evidence to bolster Polly's suspicions, and frankly, at that point, the investigation was quietly dropped.
15 months later, and having unearthed a body, Divisional Detective Inspector Frederick Hatton was on the hunt for a killer. The famous pathologist, Dr. Keith Simpson, had thoroughly examined the remains and provided detailed information concerning the dead woman. But it was Hatton's job to come up with her name. And then, a curious coincidence came to light.
One name that particularly caught his eye was that of one Rachel Dobkin. Now, there was a curious coincidence here, because Hatton knew that Rachel Dobkin's estranged husband, Harry Dobkin, had worked as a fire watcher at 302 Cannington Lane, on the site where this particular body had been found.
And that was when they began to put 2 and 2 together.
Miss Polly Dubinsky had spent months worrying about her sister's whereabouts. The police had a body, but Miss Dubinsky would not have recognized the shriveled corpse, now lying in Guy's Hospital, as that of her sister, Rachel. It was the job of Detective Inspector John Keeling to obtain a photograph and description of Mrs. Dobkin.
Polly gave a lot more information about her sister, which did tie up with what Keith Simpson had found. Polly said she was exactly my height. Well, Polly Dubinsky was 5'1", like her sister, and she was 47 years of age. Well, that tied up with between 40 and 50 years of age, you see. And she had suffered from a fibroid of the womb, and she'd been to the London hospital for treatment and had refused to have an operation, and that again tied up. She was married to this chap, Harry Dobkin, and he worked as a fire watcher next door to the Baptist chapel. So everything began to dovetail in beautifully.
Now that he had this significant lead, Dr. Simpson sought to finally confirm the identity of the body. And using a revolutionary technique, Dr. Simpson gave Rachel Dobkin's skull a face once more.
Photo superimposition relies upon having the photograph of the skull and a photograph of the person in life, and then matching the two together.
In the case of Mrs. Dobkin, it was really quite conclusive because her face in life, the photograph we had of her, completely fitted her skull.
It's a very important way of confirming an identity, but it will not of itself give a positive identification.
For the final evidence, Dr. Simpson turned to the victim's upper jaw.
The victim had quite an unusual upper jaw. Quite a lot of teeth are missing. There are 3 teeth in the top right at the back, and there's only 1 tooth at the top left. Dr. Simpson cottoned on to the fact that if you could get previous records that had been made about the teeth by their dentists, then you could compare them with the body that you were trying to identify and maybe get a click.
It was Detective Inspector Keeling who proceeded to track down Mrs. Dobkin's dental surgeon. Presently he was found, a Mr. Barnet A. Kopkin of Crouch End.
When the police went to interview Kopkin, brilliantly, he had superb records of the work that he carried out on Mrs. Dobkin. He was capable from them of producing a beautiful little diagram, and it showed no teeth at the front at the top. It showed 3 molars up here, 1 molar up here. All the information that Keith Simpson had been brooding over came out from these dental records and this diagram.
Mr. Kopkin was then invited to Dr. Simpson's laboratory to compare his diagram with the upper jaw of the body.
Mr. Kopkin came in, and I was standing just behind him. And the teeth were facing upwards, so that Mr. Kopkin couldn't help but get a very good glimpse of the view of the jaw. He said, "That is Mrs. Dobkin's upper jaw. I recognized it instantly, and she was one of my patients."
At last, the police considered the identity of the remains established without a doubt. Now was the time for the police to confront Harry Dobkin with the news that they had recovered his wife's body. He claimed to know nothing, but the police suspected otherwise.
At the time of his wife's disappearance, Harry Dobkin was working as a fire watcher at 302 Kennington Lane. Now, his job as a fire watcher was to keep an eye on a paper store that formed part of the site, and Dobkin's function was to make sure that they weren't hit by enemy incendiaries and that they were all safe.
But after just 2 weeks into his new job, a mysterious fire broke out in the crypt of the ruined Baptist chapel.
Curiously, since it was Dobkin's job to report fires, in fact he did nothing, and it was only a couple of hours later that a police constable raised the alarm and called the fire brigade.
There were no air raid attacks that night, and no inflammable material was known to have been kept in the cellar. So was it just pure coincidence that the fire happened to take place on the 15th of April? Only 4 days after the disappearance of Mrs. Rachel Dobkin.
You see, they didn't know that there was a body there, so they didn't put it 2 and 2 together. This man was trying to burn a body. All they knew was that there was a fire in this premises, and there was no reason why there should be a fire.
About half an hour after the fire had been put out, another police officer called to the scene, saw Harry Dobkin loitering around and asked him what he was doing. Dobkin said he was the fire watcher at 302 Kennington Lane, and then pointed to the smouldering ruins of the chapel and said, "I'm the fire watcher over there, but I didn't do it."
It was very suspicious, and the clergyman went round the next morning, and a mattress, a straw-filled mattress, had been taken in there from where he did not know and torn open, and straw was scattered about, so that it looked to him as if this was an intentional fire.
Later that day, enemy planes dropped a landmine, killing 23 people. The disaster was considered only incidental, so it was no surprise that a small fire in the nearby Baptist chapel was just put out and forgotten.
When Dobkin left his job as a fire watcher in May 1942, he had, as he admitted to the police, no reason to return. But in fact, the police picked him up on this. They produced a bobby who had seen Dobkin at the site on more than one occasion since May 1942. And when confronted with this at the police station, Dobkin went completely ballistic, and when confronted with the man himself, with the bobby, called him a liar to his face.
By this time, considerable circumstantial evidence was mounting against Harry Dobkin.
Mr. Dubinsky had first of all been so suspicious about Harry Dobkin, and it was known that his wife said she'd caused trouble for him because he didn't pay her maintenance regularly. His wife has disappeared. She's found under a slab next door to the premises where he works as a fire watcher. There's been a fire broken out, and obviously an attempt has been made to burn the body.
He was the only person with legitimate access to the cellar.
Then they had the woman's body completely, absolutely corresponding with descriptions of his wife.
They found bags of builder's lime, identical to the kind that had been sprinkled on the earth covering the remains.
It absolutely does all tie together.
The police moved in and formally charged Dobkin with the murder of his wife.
The jury took just 20 minutes to consider their verdict and return it, and of course it was guilty.
The forensic evidence that convicted him of murder was the forensic evidence of damage to the voice box, which showed that Mrs. Dobkin had been strangled.
The Dobkin never confessed to the crime. But he didn't really need to, because his guilt was written all over him at the end of the trial. He collapsed, he crumbled. It was an extraordinary sight. When he was condemned to death, he was looking at us. It was really indescribably horrible. And that look on his face haunted me for years afterwards. I've never forgotten it. Never forgotten that.
Dr. Keith Simpson thought he had seen the last of Harry Dobkin when he was taken from the dock. But there was to be just one more meeting. On a foggy morning at Wandsworth Prison, Dr. Simpson conducted the customary autopsy always held on the body of a hanged person.
And he was just lying there, a very big, brawny man with the mark of the rope round his neck. And that was that. That was the finish of poor old Harry Dobkin.
Well, in next week's programme, the story behind mysterious black triangles hovering over London. That's next Friday at the same time.